Hello, I'm David Stiles. I'm Director of Corporate Governance at the FRC.
And I'm Catherine Horton, Corporate Governance Policy Advisor at the FRC. We're here today to talk to you about the new Corporate Governance Code.
There's key differences in terms of the structure and the content of the new code. In terms of the structure, there's a renewed focus on the application of the principles. That's because we recognise that companies need flexibility, but they also need rigour in the way that they apply the principles and report on how they've applied those principles. So we've refocused on the principles. There are fewer provisions than there were before. Some of the more detailed information that was in the code is now in the guidance. And the code overall is just over half the length that it was before. But it actually does contain different content. So in terms of corporate governance, we've broadened the way in which companies and investors should interpret the word corporate governance. It's about board processes, yes, it's about board evaluations, it's about the role of the company secretary. Those things are of course very, very important indeed, but it's also about the way in which the board relates to the company and the way in which the company relates to a wider range of stakeholders, and stakeholders are a key theme in the new corporate governance code.
The code obviously proposed a number of mechanisms by which you could engage with your workforce. These were ones that the government had asked us to consult on. Through the feedback we had to the consultation, it became clear that obviously there were a number of methods already employed by companies out there, and that some form of flexibility would have been welcomed. In the end, what we've actually come down on is a combined provision that relates to the company's engagement with its key stakeholders and how it reports on those along the lines of the new legislation requirement, and now also includes under the terms of what engagement with the workforce you should follow. Other than the three methods, it talks about the need for the company to explain, if they've chosen an alternative method, how that works and why it considered it effective. So it's much more driving information in terms of how that engagement mechanism affects board decision making. So we're looking at the outcomes.
Well, as I said at the beginning, the code's slightly different in structure and in length. In terms of reporting on the new code, we want companies to think quite deeply about the new set of principles in the code and how they should apply them. The listing rules ask companies to do two things: to report on how they apply the principles of the code in a manner that shareholders can evaluate, and then I also ask them to report on their compliance with or otherwise with the more detailed provisions of the code, and where they depart from those provisions, providing an explanation. And what I think companies should focus on is the quality of those explanations. So deciding where they need to depart from a provision which sets out what good practice is, deciding when they do that, what route that they take and how they describe that route to shareholders. And it should be done in a way that shareholders can understand the rationale behind their decisions. It's also very important that shareholders, when they're reading company explanations, take the time to read them properly, understand them, and make judgments about how the company has interpreted the code.
The new code covers diversity in a number of different areas. There is a widening of the aspects of diversity in terms of not just looking at gender, but looking at race, looking at the kind of cognitive and personal strength of the board and its educational background. So it's trying to look at diversity in a widest possible sense of the word. We've also incorporated more detailed reporting by the nomination committees around what they do in terms of the company's diversity policy, which links into the new disclosure and transparency rules that came in the other year. There's also just an emphasis really on terms of how the board is composed and how the directors are chosen. We're also looking for diversity in terms of having the board composition reviewed in terms of how it is made up and how those individuals interact with each other and how they to create the most effective board as possible.
Corporate governance is critical to the UK economy. The FRC's mission is to promote transparency and integrity in business. And over the past 26 years, the code has been successful in doing that. But the code can't stand still. We need to look, as we've said, at the structure of the code, at the content of the code. And we realise that the role of stakeholders in corporate governance has become more and more important. So this code is about the board processes, the role of the company secretary, the role of board evaluation in promoting effective boards, but that leads to sound decision making and the long-term success of companies for the future.
Apart from dealing with the corporate governance code changes, we've been working in parallel on some initial thoughts on what we would do with the UK stewardship code, and the consultation document contains some high-level questions on the future direction of that. We will be back in probably a late autumn with a more detailed draft of a new UK stewardship code for consultation, with the likelihood that a new version would be published in spring next year. Meanwhile, we've obviously published the new weights principles covering large private companies' corporate governance framework. That's out for review until early September, with the final version of that launched just before Christmas this year. So we've got a lot of work ongoing, but it's been useful to get the wider outreach that we've done throughout 2017 and a greater input into our reviews.
We hope the new code will promote transparency and integrity in business and the long-term success of companies.